Greetings, all you intercessors, assault intercessors, heavy intercessors, death company intercessors, eradicators, inceptors, incursors. And welcome to this video, where I, the creature living under your floorboards, just aimlessly wishlist things I want changed or added in the next edition Space Marine Codex. Can you tell that a big video is taking a lot longer to make than expected? Right, before we begin, I just want to set some ground rules and expectations. 1, I am not confined by reality. In other words, I don't have to tailor my list based on what I think GW would realistically do, but rather what I think would deliver the best experience for myself and my fellow Space Marine players. 2, the things in the list have to be in direct response to a problem I have with the current game. So I can't, as an example, just be like, I want them to add Legion Basilisks. You know, the rhinos with the basilisk cannons on them from Horus Heresy, because I think it'd be cool. No, that doesn't solve an actual problem with the current codex, even though Legion Basilisks are fucking funny. It doesn't do anything to actually improve the army, and I'm trying to avoid just making a list of Legends units I want put back in the codex. Though, I will be reserving a freebie to, use later for that exact purpose. I'll just be keeping it up there. I'll let you know when I use it. And finally, the question of meta, which is a question I won't be concerning myself with. Why? Well, the pithy answer is because neither does GW, but the real answer is that there's too many hypotheticals going on. There's no way to know what the meta will look like for a hypothetical new army book in a hypothetical new edition, because for all we know, 10th is going to be another grand rules reset which changes how the game is played in its entirety. I won't be concerning myself with whether these changes will be over or underpowered, because I can't make decisions based on the meta of 10th edition, because it's an edition that doesn't exist yet. So, with that being said, let's get to the list. So, I think one of the biggest issues right now with Space Marines in the current edition is that they're not particularly strong. Wait, I thought we weren't talking about meta. Well, yeah, we're not. I'm more talking about stat lines. Space Marines are meant to be the peak of human advancement, not as strong as a Thunder Warrior or the Custodes, but striking the perfect balance between superhuman strength, durability, and discipline, and some level of disposability. Clad in the greatest arms and armor the Imperium can provide, wielding the holy relic weapons known as bolt guns. Except, well, those bolt guns are having circles ran around them by basically every other gun in the game, with las guns actively outshooting them most of the time. Auspex Tactics made a really great video about this that I'll leave down below, but basically, the single most iconic weapon of the single most iconic faction in the whole game, which is venerated in lore as basically being a man-portable, fully automatic anti-tank rifle, gets outshone by practically every other line infantry gun in the game. Space Marines are the elite of the elite, but it's hard to take them seriously when the elite of the elite are regularly outshot by veteran guardsmen. Which is kind of a misnomer, since the survival rate of Imperial Guardsmen is measured in hours, so a quote-unquote veteran is basically just the guy who made it a whole 2 feet past the trenches before being cut down by machine gun fire. That guy's a more threatening presence in the shooting phase than the transhuman warrior elite, who's not only been genetically augmented to shit, but has also been training since he was a prepubescent child, and likely had to survive a century of his chapter intentionally trying to kill him to filter out less worthy aspirants. Factions in wargames are like classes in a tabletop role-playing game. They're designed to fulfill a certain fantasy. You really wouldn't enjoy playing paladins in D&D if rogues were tankier. This is because when you choose to play a paladin character, part of the appeal is the ability to play the role of the Holy Protector, the bulwark of light between your allies and the darkness of an uncaring and cold world. So if the wizard could just ignore you, run up and get bludgeoned in the head as many times as you and barely have to care about it, then you'd feel like your class's fantasy wasn't being properly fulfilled by the game. At the current point in time, I feel like Space Marines really suffer from this problem. They don't have a strong class fantasy, and this goes both ways. When you play Space Marines, you want to feel like something of an overdog, outnumbered by nearly everything in the galaxy, but capable of being a strong bulwark against the teeming hordes of lesser foes through your presence as a force multiplier. And similarly, when you play the Imperial Guard, a big aspect of their appeal is in the underdog fantasy, of persevering and defeating insurmountable odds through grit, determination, and sacrifice. When Guards shoot better than Space Marines, there's a problem, because now neither player is experiencing their desired faction fantasy. How would I go about fixing this? Well, I'd probably not touch the actual stat line of the models themselves. Space Marines have really good stats. Strength and Toughness 4 with 2 wounds a pop and the iconic Space Marine triple threes is amazing, but they're pretty severely lacking in terms of ranged firepower. Most of their ranged weapons are Strength 4, AP 0 or -1, and D1, which in a game where pulse rifles and whatever the fuck this monstrosity is exists, yeah, doesn't really cut it. So I'd probably just make their weapons more powerful, which you can do any myriad of ways. As a result of this, I would also like to see Space Marines become far more elite, being fielded in numbers similar to the new Leagues of Votann, who I think actually play very similarly to how I'd want Space Marines to play in the 10th edition Codex, just with more of an emphasis on tactical flexibility rather than just being a gunline army. When you think of the current Space Marine Codex, what do you think of? Yeah, it's probably an insane amount of extra thick data sheets. Hundreds of data sheets, most of which probably haven't even seen use since the late 90s. When was the last time you played against a Space Marine army that brought Thunderfire cannons? Don't you fucking lie to me! Has anyone ever uttered the sentence, "My favorite Space Marine unit is the Hammerfall bunker"? No? I literally invented a new sentence. No one's ever said that before. There are 96 data sheets in the Codex Space Marines. I counted them by hand. That number goes to over 100 if you count all the units that are in Legends, and that doesn't count the units that are in the Codex supplements. There's already a handful of units that have been cut from the Codex over the years, and it's still massive. But almost none of the units ever see time on the tabletop. Obviously, the rule of large numbers is a factor here. Across the no doubt tens or even hundreds of millions of individual games that have occurred across the world, somebody's probably taken a Storm Talon gunship or a Gladiator Valiant, or maybe even a Firestrike servo turret. But it's not good game design when you have a faction that has 96 individual units that could be taken, and yet only like 15 get consistently used. And even then, there's a lot of bloat within those 15-odd actually regularly used units. Like, at this point, there are no statistical differences between Primaris Marines and regular Firstborn, save for an extra attack. So why not combine some of these units? Here's the idea I came up with, though I stole bits of it from conversations I've had with patrons about this issue. Instead of having intercessors, heavy intercessors, eradicators, hellblasters, you remember the opening bit from this video. I can move on. Why not just fold them into the regular Firstborn units? So let's say a tactical squad. A tactical squad can spend however many points to replace models with specific kinds of Primaris Marines. So if you wanted, you could replace one of your tactical Marines with a heavy intercessor, and then as per the one heavy weapons option, replace that heavy intercessor's heavy bolt rifle with the executor heavy bolter. And then you can replace another one of your Marines with a hell blaster with a plasma incinerator for your special weapons option. And then intercessors just become a cosmetic option because in an ideal world, the bolt gun would just have the same profile of the bolt rifle anyway. That's just one example though. There are tons of examples of Primaris units that are essentially the same unit but with different war gear options. Suppressors and Inceptors both have the same stat line, it's just the difference between assault bolters or autocannons. Why can't that just be a war gear option? The fact that Firstborn Scouts just are a sneaky unit that can combine bolt guns, bolt pistols, and combat knives, demolitions weapons, and sniper rifles into a single unit makes it look really silly when each of those options are a different Phobos unit. Infiltracers, Incursors, Reavers, Eliminators, these are so clearly just the same unit with different war gear options that have been divided into 4 different units for no valid gameplay reason. It's why, honestly, I don't think Space Marines are a good army for new players anymore. Which leads into my final wish. Right after I use that freebie. Why the hell did Honor Guard get put into Legends? So, for those who need to be reminded, Honor Guard are the most skilled martial warriors in a chapter, tasked with the duty of acting as the personal retinue of chapter masters, and more rarely, captains. In the lore, every Codex-compliant chapter has their own version of the Honor Guard, or at the very least some kind of equivalent, like the Space Wolves' Wolf Guard or the Blood Angels' Sanguinary Guard. And yeah, there they are, right there in 8th edition's Codex Space Marines. But with the release of the Ultramarines Codex supplement in 2018, the Honor Guard was made into an Ultramarines exclusive unit, along with the new extra Ultramarines exclusive version of the Honor Guard called the Victrix Honor Guard. And then the generic version was slapped into Legends. Now, bear in mind, this didn't come with any kind of lore change. Every Codex-compliant chapter of Space Marines still has some equivalent to the Honor Guard. They just can't field them anymore. No reason for it, it just happened. I think the real reason why is because GW generally frowns upon needing to kit bash to make units, and the only Honor Guard model GW sells is for the Ultramarines, with very explicitly Ultramarines iconography. So if you wanted to make an Honor Guard of any other chapter, you had to kit bash them, which, in my opinion, the interchangeability of basically every Space Marine infantry kit allowing you to make incredibly unique looking models is one of the reasons why I think the Space Marines are one of the best model lines in 40k. But hey, clearly GW doesn't agree with me because they relegated non-Ultramarines Honor Guard to Legends, where they'll probably stay for the foreseeable future. And I'm using my freebie to say, please, let them pass! Okay, what was I talking about before? Oh, right. Now, I will say, Age of Sigmar has this exact same problem. Stormcast Eternals have so many more units than every other army that, for new players, it can kind of feel overwhelming. You don't know what's good, what basically every list wants to have more of, and what you generally want to avoid. Stormcast Eternals have more HQ options than Ironjawz have units by a factor of 10. The same applies to Space Marines. Like I said before, there are 96 different data sheets in the most recent Space Marine Codex, and with the new Codex supplement system, the main Codex only gives you the units every chapter can use. Your chapter will probably have 2 or 3 unique units, so that's another layer of filtering you have to do to make your list. Not to mention, a bunch of old named character models recently got discontinued, like Pedro Cantor and Captain Lysander, so I know we're all just waiting for them to get the Primaris treatment, which, if previous history repeats, means even more data sheets! Yeah! The result of this is that Space Marines are actually kind of a terrible army for new players, because their Codex is a minefield of secretly awful units. Apothecaries are just kind of worse than Primaris Apothecaries. 4 different Ancients. Most of the vehicles are completely useless because Primaris units need their own dedicated transports, because for some reason they just refuse to get into any tank that doesn't hover. Assault squads are a dedicated melee elite's choice that is statistically worse in melee than your dedicated melee troops choice. This is what I mean when I say that having this many units makes them a bad army for new players, because so much of their army is just worthless. So not only do you get the negatives of overchoice, it's fake overchoice, because most of the choices aren't actually valid choices. You have 96 units to choose from, and 76 of those choices are the wrong choice. You see the problem? Trimming down Space Marines would make them better for new players, because what's left after the purge can just be the good stuff, the stuff that's actually worth taking. And it's something GW used to do in the past. 3rd edition's Codex Space Marines had a group of character units called Heroes. Heroes could be taken as leaders, commanders, or force commanders, and these were basically cheaper captains with worse stat lines. The obvious question arose: why would you spend like 350 points to have a leader with the stat line of a sergeant that had Terminator honors, a power fist, a plasma cannon, an iron halo, and a few other random gubbins, when you could just buy a captain? Or, for that amount of points, a named chapter master. So this style of unit got phased out over time, eventually focusing on the quartet of Space Marine HQs we're familiar with: captains, librarians, chaplains, and tech marines. Heroes, lieutenants, commanders, whatever the fuck, all just add more things a new player, or hell, any player, just has to filter through. It's a tricky situation, because wargaming is as much an artistic hobby or narrative experience as it is a game, and sometimes what's best for the game isn't what's best for either the hobby or narrative side. It's one of the most frustrating things that can possibly happen. I mean, I know a guy who frequents my friendly local game store who had 3,000 points of Dark Elves, an army that just no longer exists. So, with that being said, I understand completely why the Space Marine Codex is in the state it's in. It's kind of hard for it not to be. There's a reason why the only data sheets I talked about getting removed from the Codex were the ones that were model agnostic, that you were just expected to kit bash for yourself. All the heroes in your army could then just be reflavored as captains, or Terminator captains, or bike captains. Well, right up until bike captains got shunted into legions too, I suppose. It's a tough situation, because every unit probably has one or two players that love that unit so much they're willing to make an entire themed army around them. I don't exactly know who's running around with a 2,000 point Centurion army, but I'm sure one exists. But GW didn't care about that when they made Age of Sigmar and took over half the armies out back and fucking shot them, so why do they suddenly care now? Because the core issue plaguing everything here is that Games Workshop is too cagey when it comes to how they handle Space Marines. They have a vision of how Space Marines ought to play, with super balanced and versatile datasheets that are just okay at everything. More elite than Eldar or Imperial Guard, but not as elite as Custodes. Shootier than Orcs, but not more so than Tau. You get the idea. But the consequence of that is that they have no identity, and where yes, you can carve one out for yourself more so than with any other faction, the faction is still going to just be a collection of worse versions of the toys that every other faction has. There's this somewhat prevalent idea in the community that Space Marines are, essentially, a starter army. Their flexibility and their large range of options means you can play them long enough to find out which units you like, and then abandon the army to focus on one that hones in more on that kind of unit or playstyle. Almost like if you're still playing Space Marines 1 or 2 years into your hobby journey, you're somehow doing it wrong. And yeah, this rings true for most people. Most people's first miniature is a Space Marine. Most people's first army are Space Marines, and eventually most people move on to greener pastures. And where, yeah, a lot of people like me stay with the army long term, what are we left with? An army that's just kind of worse than every other army at what they do. I think that's the overarching issue that all three of these wishes seek to remedy. Give the Space Marines a stronger identity. At the start of every edition, Space Marines are the strongest army, because they get their Codex first, so all of their toys are updated for the power creep of a new edition. And so for a while, they just have better versions of every other faction's gimmicks. But then, as those factions get their army books, Space Marines get phased out of the meta, because every other army also gets their updated versions of their gimmicks, and Space Marines are left with nothing. It sounds rich for a Space Marine player to complain about not having the best toys, since the model line gets updated constantly with new units, but every time, so few of those units end up actually being worth taking. I would sacrifice 1 million Firestrike servo turrets to get a Codex that actually has a strong core identity. Wow, okay, that got, got a bit more heated than I was expecting. But, thanks for watching to the end of the video. I've heard some rumors about 10th edition being a full reset, and if that happens, I'd be very interested in seeing how many of these changes get implemented, because if they end up making a complete overhaul of the rule set again, then basically anything is on the table. With that, if you want to give me money to keep making these videos, it's patreon.com/Mander. If you want to, you can follow me over on Twitter at SallyMander40K. That's about it. Have a good one. Storm Lord.